To me, that's greatness. To me, that is greatness. Like you're in the presence of greatness. You're in somebody who in their chosen field has reached an elite level and they continue on that path. But so when you observe them, you just see somebody who's really, really good at something and has been good. Yeah, but what you haven't seen is maybe it takes a while to notice they've adapted, they've learned, they've overcome, and they're continuing. That's very, very impressive and rare.
Hi folks, I'm Dan Dworkis, and this is the Emergency Mind Podcast, a space where we bring together lessons from the emergency department and beyond about performance when it matters the most in applying knowledge under pressure. Now, our guest this episode is Dr. Fergus Connolly. Fergus is a performance coach of the world's great elite performers in the most demanding high-performance organizations across sport, the special forces, and business. He holds a PhD in computer-based manufacturing optimization from the University of Limerick in Ireland, and he's worked in essentially every major sport: the Premier League, Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NHL, the NBA, and international rugby. He also works with leaders in Fortune 500 companies and members of the Special Forces community, all around improving human performance and helping to design winning teams and winning cultures. Now, this is one of those podcasts that was honestly just an absolute joy to record, and we probably spoke for about twice as long as what actually made it into this final cut, since there is literally just so much depth in what Fergus does and how he approaches complex problem sets around human performance. We talk about elite performance and being an elite performer, building mental models of individuals and teams, and I just love this, going paradox hunting to find the hidden keys to greatness. We also talk about how elite teams build and maintain culture and just so much more in this conversation. Now, if you like what you're hearing on the Emergency Mind podcast, be sure to share with your team and drop us a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. This really helps us get the word out about what we're doing at the Emergency Mind Project. Want to learn even more? Head to emergencymind.com/sign up to join the deeper conversation. All right, all that said, let's jump into this awesome episode. I hope you enjoy. Fergus, thank you so much for joining the podcast, man. I have loved our interaction in the internet world, and I'm super psyched to sit down and talk with you. I think there's so much our listeners are going to get out of digging into this. So I'm honored you join. Thanks for coming.
No, thank you for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Do you mind giving folks just a real quick overview of like who you are and what your deal is? And then there's just like going to be like an explosion of thoughts here in just a second. So,
well, yeah, the first giveaway is that I'm Irish. I grew up in Ireland during the 80s, during a very interesting time. I went, first of all, I just was fascinated by sports people, but I never thought of a career in sport. I decided I would become a teacher and I would coach. Went to university, did a master's, did a PhD. My original degree was in woodwork and construction. My master's was in manufacturing. My PhD ended up being in computer-based optimization. But all of the time, I was just fascinated by what is an elite performer, or what is greatness, and particularly around sport. When I finished that, I would travel around the world. I used to write down the names of who are the best athletes and who are their coaches, and I would save money and hop on a plane, go to New Zealand, go to the States, go to Canada, anywhere. It was email was just starting, so I sent one or two. I remember getting calls. Actually, my parents would answer the phone and they would go, "Hey Fergus, there's somebody, I think he's from England or something. Did you send some person a letter?" And I did. I would write letters to people who'd written books, asking questions about all kinds of stuff. And anyway, that was it. I was just fascinated by what makes somebody perform at a really high level. On one of these trips, Premier League team, they had just changed staff. One of them called me afterwards and said, "Look, we've changed staff. You were here. You seem to know a lot about..." Actually, one of the things they had started looking at was heart rate variability, which this is 20 odd years ago. And actually, we started to import gas for cryotherapy from Poland. Like this is nobody else was looking at. So we have an opening. Are you interested? And so that's when I started in the Premier League with Bolton Wanderers. Then worked in international rugby, consulted for NFL teams, then eventually got offers from NFL teams to come and work. Consulted for some special forces units, NBA, NHL teams, and somebody asked me, what was your plan? And when I figure that out, I'll let you know. It's kind of like we were talking. It's kind of like we were talking at the beginning. You've a passion for trying to understand what is a high performer, and the more you learn, the more you realize actually there's something else, or I don't know it all, and there's more I need to keep learning. So yeah, I've been fortunate, very fortunate. I never worked with, academies or development. My first role was straight in working with multi-million-dollar soccer players from all around the world actually as well, which was interesting, different cultures. And so yeah, it was a baptism of fire.
Absolutely amazing. And the detail that you started with woodworking is incredible. Love that. I don't know, I'm going to draw a line here, and I'm curious if this is a line that exists only in my mind, or so please fact check me if I'm completely making this up. But I wonder, when you think about the discipline of being a craftsman, of really working on your craft and working on yourself, there is, to me, such a parallel between what it is to shape and plane and carve and work on yourself and work on a piece of wood. There's a parallel in there somewhere that's gonna, I think this is the biggest pun I'm ever gonna make, dovetail us into elite performance in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think there are three things. There is the craftsmanship and the recognition that you're not in control completely.
Yeah.
And there's the physical aspect. The teaching aspect was really important as well, because now you've got people who, you have to light a fire in. You can't just dictate to them. And the third one, which was, and we all know this, as we get older, it's harder to learn new things. The third one that was very challenging, though, was the programming. And then so from the PhD perspective, understanding programming and engineering, where it's very logical and analytical. And so then when you work in high-performing teams, today particularly, you have a combination of all of those things. There's a people aspect which you can't ignore. You've got structure, strategy, scheduling, and you've got technology, and then you've got the art and skill. And so I think people are more aware now that you just can't rely purely on technology to solve a problem, particularly around humans. And so it's a combination of all of those things, and how do you make them work best, particularly in time-constrained contexts. So yeah, it's the learning curve is, and then of course the other thing, which at the beginning was very stressful, but looking back on it was brilliant, was having to do this in different cultures, different states. Even if you speak the same language, it's still very, very different. I remind people in the States, if you go to New Orleans, they speak a little bit different, eat different food than perhaps Texas. There's 50 different countries on one big island. So even speaking the same language, even within the same country, culturally there are massive differences that you have to appreciate when you're engaging with people. So all of those things have fascinate me.
I'm going to point out, for my own ego protection, that Fergus at least smiled a little bit at my dovetail joke, which you can't see if you listen to this on audio. I just want to put that in the universe record. But anyway, let's ignore that for a second. So Fergus, we're gonna go to culture, and I think we're going to spend probably a lot of our time there, because I think that's one of the things that we understand the least when it comes to developing high performance teams and individuals. But before we go to culture, I want to take a step back towards the individual for a second and try to triangulate into this space of what is an elite performer. When you say elite performer, what is it to be elite?
Yeah, so to me, an elite performer is somebody who can execute refined set of skills, and by refined I mean accurate and precise, in a very specific constrained context. Now, if you break that down, it's somebody, here's part of the irony: the more elite they become, the more specialized they become. And actually then sometimes people wonder, why aren't they elite in everything? And the context is critical as well. People, I think, sometimes forget the importance of the context. What also happens is the refinement of skills means that they can execute those skills towards a target, to execute a specific outcome. And again, the better you become at it, the more specialized. But if we take them out of that context, they're not elite. So if I put you in the kitchen, for example, you may or may not be elite.
Yeah, I'm not totally. So there's also the counterpoint of there are things that make individuals elite that transcend domain, right? That transcend exact context. And some of them are context specific and some of them are not at all context specific, right? So you get on one hand, the ultra specialized surgeon that does a particular procedure over and over again. And by controlling as much of their environment as possible, they're able to really optimize outcomes in a way that is truly elite and to push that one surgery forward. And then on the other hand, you have the people like, say, Josh Waitzkin, for instance, who is, a well-renowned expert at Tai Chi and chess and jiu-jitsu and all of these things, and seems to have developed a pattern of learning as what he is elite in. And so how do you deal with that sort of tension?
The more specialized you become, then the challenge is the transfer of skills and the transfer of qualities across, and then how adaptable one is. The greatest challenge in that instance very often is a psychological one, because at the beginning there's a great challenge in recognizing that there's going to be a learning curve. So sometimes what you'll see is when somebody transitions from out of one area into another, they really struggle with that, the failure and the acceptance of failure, because they have become accustomed to incredible success in one particular area. So to me, somebody who can transfer skills is very adaptable, is somebody who's very, very comfortable recognizing that so-called failure is part of that learning process. And that's very, very important for long-term, for sustaining elite performance. That's very, very important. And I think sometimes we take that for granted.
So it's useful to maybe pause and define here something that we haven't talked about a while on the podcast, which is skill transfer and transference. So you have sort of near transfer, which is I know skill X and I can do skill X plus 1 or X minus 1, things that are really close to it, right? I can do a particular setup in one sport. I can sort of play a sport that's like sort of kind of next to it, or I can maybe change positions temporarily to fill in a gap, right? And then you have far transfer, which is like a elite surgeon reading the inner game of tennis, right? And taking concepts from tennis and transferring them over to eye surgery, which is a very different thing on the surface. And that's a far transfer of skill. So it sounds like what you're saying is that, or am I reading it right, that far transference and adaptability is a wonderful thing to have, but not necessarily innate to elite performance? Like it's maybe a different thing?
It's certainly rare. It's certainly rare. And I think there's, in my experience, the biggest challenge there is ego. That's where I see most people struggle, because, again, they have become accustomed and used to, they've gained recognition at being, so now to start and to struggle in a new area and to go on that path again to reach that, many of them really struggle at that point. In the near transfer, it's like the famous Sports Illustrated cover and book, Why Michael Couldn't Hit. Michael Jordan then goes to baseball and he struggles. So again, you're talking about, a far transfer of skills. Even though he's still an elite athlete, there is coordination, motor skills that again has to start, and there's a journey there.
All right. So we're backing ourselves in a good way, into a more robust definition of what it is to be elite at a thing. And we're talking about how it's contextual. You can be elite at X without necessarily being elite at Y. Adaptability and transference is sometimes part of that, but not always. But what that leaves us with, I think, is eliteness character traits? Is eliteness skills that we develop? Is eliteness come from inside or outside or both?
Well, it depends on, you can't be great at everything and be elite. So is somebody truly elite if they're great at everything? It's questionable. That would be a really impressive person. So the context, I think, becomes very, very important. But I think that if you're looking at somebody who can sustain success, there are a set of character traits, beliefs and values, I think, that are important to them, because that's what is fundamental to how they drive forward. So for example, humility, so again, during this next learning curve where they're starting to adapt and transfer, they're humble enough to accept, okay, I'm going to struggle here, I'm going to make mistakes, and that's going to keep, so there will be a certain number of character traits, I think, that are important. I'm thinking back just to different athletes who had long careers that I worked with. Humility in particular was important because throughout their career they have to change how they approach the game, the things they do, which means learning something new. Learning something new is going to be embarrassing. It's going to be humiliating. Now within it, nobody's going to see it, but they're going to do it and they're happy to do it and they're happy to be embarrassed. They're happy to suffer, and then slowly they get good, and that continues. That allows them to sustain their career, because the old skill set, use Michael Jordan, early on, incredibly athletic. Later on, as that starts to wane, has to learn a new set of skills. So has to learn a fadeaway jumper. Pretty sure when he started doing that, it was bad, but he was doing it in private, humbling himself, learning, blah, blah, blah. And then you see it on the court. So that ability to continue to learn and adapt, that's what I think is critical to sustaining success. Otherwise, you have a set of skills, very well refined, executed in a particular context. What happens if something changes?
Yeah, so we're starting to get here into a difference between somebody that can be elite at a moment in time and space at a particular thing versus somebody or an individual or a team or a group that is elite over long periods of time, right? That sustains and continues to excel and continues to grow. Yeah,
and those people are fascinating. To me, that's greatness. To me, that is greatness. Like you're in the presence of greatness. You're in somebody who, in their chosen field, has reached an elite level, and they continue on that path. But so when you observe them, you just see somebody who's really, really good at something and has been good. Yeah, but what you haven't seen is maybe it takes a while to notice they've adapted, they've learned, they've overcome, and they're continuing. That's very, very impressive. And rare, quite rare. Somebody who can, stay in the game. Yeah, that's rare.
And when you look at yourself now versus when you first started, as you're telling us those stories of sending letters to folks, what do you see about greatness and human performance now that was invisible to you then when you started?
Man, so much. Like, when I started out, it was, okay, why are they great? And it's almost like you start out and you latch onto one thing. So for example, in sport, it's fitness. They're just the fittest. But then as you start to work with people, you start to hang on a second, there's stuff here that doesn't make sense. The guy who runs the least or the guy who's unfittest, why is he the best player? There's so many different paradoxes. You walk into a professional team, the guy who has the worst diet is maybe your best player. That doesn't make sense. The guy who's the hardest working actually is cut from the team. There's so many paradoxes when you're in the environment. So what you start to realize is that this is a multifaceted and a multiphasic problem that you're trying to solve. And so what you start then to realize is, okay, the very first thing I need to do is I need to model the person. I need to start to put a model around what makes up a person executing or performing in this environment as best I can. Now you start to realize there's too many things here. I can't measure everything. So now I have to kind of categorize them. And then what you start to recognize is, okay, I only know about one or two areas. There's a whole other area. And that's a black box to me. I need to learn. I need to understand. I need to understand how it contributes. And so the better then that you can understand the holistic performer, at least if you don't have the solutions, at least you have an awareness that there are other factors here. And so, making a short answer long, that's kind of been, I guess, my journey in the realization, okay, there's a lot more here to an elite performer, for example, in sport than just fitness. There's a lot more to sustaining success than mental toughness. And recognizing as well that as people go through their careers, the dominance changes, the things they rely on change.
Can we press on that a little bit? So how do you build a mental model of how somebody is performing? What does that look like? Like, let's say you get contacted by, tomorrow, Team X, and Team X can be sports or medicine or some of the, elite business groups that you work with, or the soft community, or anybody, and they drop you in day one. How do you start building that mental model?
So this is a generalization, but today people generally are very, very good at the one thing they do. If they're an engineer, an architect, whatever, generally they're very good at that because you've gone to school, you've gone to university, you've studied, and again, you've specialized in that area. So that's the first starting point. Like, can somebody do their job? And then is there additional training or experience that they need to get? And then beyond that, then it's how do they work with others, and then what are the other skills? So like your ability to communicate in your team, in your group, that's going to impact. You can be the best surgeon, best trauma surgeon, whatever, but and at one moment in time it might be fine, but you got to work. Everybody has to work with somebody. So can you communicate? Can you build a team? Can you lead? And then also then you've got the external elements, which are in their personal life, their own personal health and wellness. How does that affect performance? So now you start to build out a model. Now, as people tend to get older, the other underlying one then is one's purpose and morals, ethics, values, which, and again, like, I know you're smiling, but all of these things matter. And in, in critical moments, they matter most. So you start to build a model, and what you're looking for is you're looking for, okay, what's the limiting factor? What is the one thing that we can flip that can accelerate so many of these other things? Because often it can be one thing holding somebody back.
So you're almost building out sort of your idea of how the person's functioning, and then you're looking for rate limiting steps and pinch points, and also areas where there's paradox, where something doesn't make sense, where it would seem like somebody would do X, but actually they're vastly overperforming or underperforming based on what you'd expect out of that person.
Yeah, sorry to use the term in this great book. It is rate limiting though. But yeah, so what you're looking for is, I call them, I refer to them as limiting factors. Like, so you can have somebody who is technically brilliant and do their job exceptionally well, but they're not doing it well. So okay, so what is the issue? So what's holding them back? And then what you find is that there's a functional minimum that people must have in all of these areas to do their job. And if they don't reach that, well, they're probably not going to be working at the level that you're going to be engaged with them at, but there's a basic functional minimum that they must have. One other thing that you find with, back to the term elite performers are elite compensators. Like, they can compensate exceptionally well. So, back to a brilliant trauma surgeon under pressure, like very, very calm, can handle stress, brilliant, terrible communicator, but they compensate, for personality, whatever, by being brilliant at their job but that will only work so long. And then eventually, so again, having that holistic model becomes important for sustaining success and then onto greatness. That to me is what becomes critical.
So cool.
Well, this is how I see it. This is how I view it. And like we were talking earlier, I just have lots more questions than I do answers. But this is trying to put the pieces together. That's how I've tried to approach understanding what an elite performer is. How do you find the areas for potential? How do you improve them? And then how do you get them to a state where they can sustain that level of performance? And throw out random statistic. When you get to a certain point, 99% of it is not about your job. You know your job. Like when you get to that level, quarterback can throw the ball.
Man, there's so many directions to go with this. And I think I'm going to zoom us out just a little bit. So we've been talking this whole time about elite performers as individuals, and we've sort of, we've talked about their inner factors and their home life and their learning and the intrinsic capability they have to adapt and change. But I want to zoom us out a little bit. And so in the Emergency Mind Project, we look at sort of three levels or three tranches of sort of how things fit together. We look at the individual, the team, and the culture. And it's a bit of an artificial distinction because, sort of where are those lines, but whatever, that's kind of how we frame it. So So we've been focusing on the individual. Can we zoom out a little bit and think about the team? So in all of these teams that you've worked with, you must have seen so many models for what makes a team elite as opposed to an individual elite. I'm going to anchor us in that. And like, what has that been like as you discover how different teams approach what it is to be elite?
Yeah, and again, as you would know, like you learn as much from the bad ones as you do the good ones. Because
absolutely,
things highlighted. When you talk about culture and teams, one of the things that I looked at the person as a culture. Like, does the person have a culture? So, like, when you look at people have, and this particularly today, I think is critical. People should be allowed to have. One should enjoy others' different belief systems.
Absolutely.
And then you try to find commonality on values. So we can all, I've used, like, you've got 5 blind men around an elephant. But again, you can align on values and what your definition of honesty or integrity is. So we can all look at it differently, but we can all agree on what it is. And so now you start to pull people together on what the values are, and particularly how are they expressed, because they inform then your attitudes to different things. But fundamentally, you're really interested in behaviors, how people behave. And I call them artifacts and behaviors, but the actual physical, your presentation, whatever, and behaviors, because that's what people engage in. And I call it the 3-year rule. The professor in Portugal, he blew my mind when he explained it to me, but you can go to any organization and run it hard for 3 years. But fundamentally, by the 3rd or 4th year, this is where people now start to truly understand one another and understand if they're sincere, authentic, and genuine. And honesty or authenticity in a person, I think, is the most important thing, because you can work with anyone when you know what they are and where they're coming from, even if you don't like them, even if you don't agree with them, but you can work with them. But if you don't have that honesty, then you can't build trust. That becomes the foundation, because if you don't have trust, people spend so much energy, time, emotion worrying and concerned. And so that becomes really important when people know where they stand, because one of the fundamental things to any human, any cell, any organism is survival and security. If I feel secure, trust, even if I don't like it, or even if I can work with that person. Now, if I like them and whatever, brilliant. Now you've got something special.
So is this psychological safety that you're talking about in the way that it's normally used, or is this something else?
I guess so. The terms like psychological safety, I guess it is. I think that, or I became aware of that perhaps later.
Sure.
For me, probably the first, if you look at Patrick Lencioni's first thing, is trust is the foundation. To me, it's actually honesty. If you want to build a great team, if you've got that brutal honesty, compassionately ruthless, I call it, if you've got that, then you can move forward. Then you've got trust. But it's different. Like, it takes time to build trust.
Compassionately ruthless. I love that. So that's actually probably what you and I first interacted on, which is maybe like a great shift into that, is this idea of signals and spotters, right? Right. So we got into it over this conversation about, like, when you're trying to perform better under pressure as an individual who is part of a team, how do you turn on your internal radar and your internal set of sensors to figure out how you're doing? And how do you leverage the multi-dimensional relationships between your team members about that? And that got us to this idea of signals and spotters. Can we dive into that for a second? Can you give folks an overview of signals and spotters?
Yeah. So this is where most of the challenges for me come from. They come from a problem, and okay, how do you solve this problem? So when people react what we would term irrationally or emotionally, not on a big scale, but on a minor scale, okay, so what's the source of that? And very often you think it's something to do with a relationship, but very often you realize it's something going on in their personal life or some other stress. And so I would look at myself and go, why was I irritable, short, sharp? Why did I feel like that? What I started to notice was I would look for I went back to my old research in sport of what are the signals of overreaching and overtraining. So there's so many, like resting heart rate's up by 5, but there are lots of other ones as well. For example, hair being brittle, nails being brittle, small things. There's so many of them. But then there are just observable, subjective ones. If your room is untidy, there was other guys I would talk to, they would talk about if their car was untidy, messy. Somebody else would talk about how, my dog, when I come home, he senses when I'm a little bit stressed and anxious, so he's just more cautious. He doesn't come running. Just small things like that. For me, it was untidiness. And I remember at one particular job I was working so hard, crazy. Room wasn't tidy, or apartment wasn't tidy. So what I do, I went and hired a cleaner. And I took away that signal that I would notice. So I would put in place, like, what are the signals that we can pick up ourselves that we need to take a step back, just manage our own functional load that we have, and how can we what are those signals? Because we all want to do more, work harder. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was, in relationships externally, are there friends and family and people who can notice things about us? If somebody said to you, "Oh, Dan, you look tired," and you're thinking, "I thought I looked like $1 million," but they see something in you, So what are those, and can we become more aware of them before we have an interaction where it's displayed? And so those are that's where this idea came from. And it's something for people to think about. Is there something that you notice, just something small, that's a signal to you that there's a functional load, that you're starting to overreach before you start to break or crack?
It really comes back to honesty, what you're describing, right? Because if you and I are working together and I'm like, Fergus, I'm trying to perform better as an emergency doctor under pressure. Here's what I think some of my signals are. I need you to be compassionately ruthless with me. I need you to spot me and say, "Hey, Dan, you're like drifting a bit," right? That works because we can establish that honest relationship with each other. That's like the cement in this metaphor or whatever it is that really makes that work.
Yeah. Hey, Dan, you might be a little bit sharp with whoever. And before it's even said, you're right. And the best teams I've worked with, like coaches, you're walking out of the room after having an argument about a selection or a training process, whatever, and somebody just taps you on the shoulder and goes, "Hey, I respect your opinion, but I just disagree with you." And you just smile and laugh. Yeah, absolutely. And you want that, because you want people, so people talk about, if you look at how a team interacts, if you've got no tension among people, you're not going to have any creativity, you're not going to have any problem solving, you're not going to have any innovation. So you need it. But the foundation is being authentic, and the first place is to be honest with oneself, which is difficult. That takes a lot of work, because we all lie to ourselves all the time, but if you've got, and so now what you have is, you have this small circle where, yes, psychologically safe, but you've got this small group or relationship where you can be psychologically safe and you can be open. That's what vulnerability is.
And so you're building in this group where you have a small group of folks who are dedicated to improving themselves and to becoming elite and to achieving greatness, or to being great people, great humans. And then you create this group where you're like, "Hey, we're going to work together to do this," right? I want you to be compassionately ruthless with me. I want you to push me. I want you to make that happen. And those agreements that you're forming are the links in this cloud model or in this small group or whatever that really pushes the whole group forward. I love that.
Yeah. And you can have that externally as well. Mm-hmm. I've got people who are close to me who I don't have to ask them, they will tell me. My own coach, Ben Ives in San Diego, we will go and talk, and, I don't have to ask him, he'll tell me, and I expect him to, and if he didn't, then that's not being authentic. He was brilliant a long time ago. I was talking about something, and I was saying, I don't want to burden, whatever. And he was going, "Well, so you're not being honest." Okay, now that's hurtful. If you're not being honest and authentic and not sharing, or the other person isn't, then you're not going to have trust. And so it's going to be a very, very small group of people that you can be honest with, that you can have that vulnerability with.
I was working recently with a EMS company, an ambulance company, or a paramedic company is a better way to say it. And one of the challenges they were facing is that they're often paired as a two-person team into an ambulance for a shift, not knowing the other person ahead of time. And they're sort of like creating this flash culture between the two of them. There's this dyad, right? And they're trying to figure out how to move forward with it. And one of the solutions that this group came up with is that they wanted every team member to do some internal work to figure out what some of their signals of stress might be. And then they wanted a baseball card they could hand to each other at the beginning of the shift and be like, hey, I'm Dan. Here's my training. Here's what my big stress signal is. Can you look out for this for me? Here's the thing I'm working on myself. We're still in the process of working with them about that, but what a cool example of sort of what you're saying, right? Because it creates that instant vulnerability, that acknowledgement that my signal is maybe not the same as your signal, and that sort of buy-in to say, hey, I know you don't know me, but like, ooh, if I'm doing this, I need you to help me with it.
Yeah, and what I love about those examples, any of those examples, are somebody's trying to solve a problem. Like I just love that. What bugs me, or you go somewhere and nobody's trying. Like, try and fail. Like, the people come up like, and some of them are stupid. Like, we used to, on jerseys with one team, we used to put the learning styles, visual, kinesthetic. So we would stitch a small piece of thread, violet, red, depending on what their learning style was, so that if you were going to explain or coach this person, it should be kinesthetic, or it should be visual. Violet, get out a pen, sketch it. It's a quick way for them to pick it up. Small things like that. And listen, if it's a problem, get over it, solve it. I don't care. Like, it's a problem, solve it, or try to solve it, But I think, a baseball card. And actually on that, so one of the things I used, which ironically has been used, I know high schools have done it and tier 1 groups have used it. It's what I call a performance passport. On one page, can you assess somebody on one page? Put everything completely objectively and subjectively. And this is back to this idea of profiling, so that you could help with the person, identify where those limiting factors are, and let's if it's a problem, identify it and solve it. And truthfully, if you look at what everybody else has done, you're already going to be at least 3 years behind them, because by the time you get to that, what problem have you solve it in your environment, and be innovative and creative and back yourself, do it. But if you always look to what other people are doing, you're just behind them. You're always going to be second place. But the baseball card that's pretty cool. And if you do it in the right way as well, the first thing is, of course, the other person's going to be thinking, geez, I don't even know what to say
it's a start, right? And I think what you're describing, like it sort of gets into like the Ray Dalio idea of like, they sort of do a similar thing of, here's everything I know about myself and all these psychometric testing and all of my knowledge about myself as a person, so that we can start this conversation on not 0, but on like +1 at least, right? On like some things forward where we're sort of accelerating ourselves. What you said is so true, that if you're just doing the best of what other people have, you're already behind. And at the same time, at least you're moving forward, right? At least you're like trying to solve things and get things going. And you've made a commitment by doing that you believe you can get better, your team can get better, and you're invested in that. I think that's super important.
True. That was my old, very competitive sport side coming out, where you're looking at your competition going, what are they doing? And going, no, I want to do better. What can I do that's ahead? Because I want them to be looking at whatever I've done 2 years ago. And that's where, you want to try and solve the problem. The biggest, people talk about, problem solving techniques. No. My thing is problem identification. Can you find out what the real problem is? That's where the biggest issues are, and the greatest room for improvement is, or one of anyway, is find out what the real problem is.
Yeah. How do you do that?
again, if you don't have honesty, you're not going to find it with the person. Like it's like, like the medical expert who comes to work and they can do their job, but they're not doing it. So why? What's up? Oh, whatever, I was tired, it was whatever. Like, and you have to go, why to get to it. Now, if they're honest, the person, over coffee will tell you, man, I've got this going on, or I've got this, my daughter's really, really sick, and I didn't know, you should have told me, we can, let's solve it, take care of that. But he can do his job, or she can do her job. That's not what the problem is. And so, but again, if you don't have authenticity and honesty, being authentic oneself, you can't build an honest relationship. And if you don't have that, well, you're not going to have any psychological safety, any trust. So now you're just hiding things, from the group or from the person who can help you.
Fergus, in sort of the last of the major topics I want to touch on for a minute, you said something that I heard recently that I loved, that I'm hoping we can dive into. We've done individual, we've done team, and I want to push us into the broader aspect of the culture of an organization for a moment. And you said culture coaches when you're not around. And yeah. Man, I loved that. Talk to me about that. What's going on there?
So the great teams that I've been part of, you find that they're not, like, there's not one person leading it, so it's not like the head coach or whatever. So you might be in the locker room and you notice a standard, like, is an expectation, like nobody leaves the locker room untidy, but there's nobody there pointing it out. And I was going, why? Like, nobody's going, or it might be left untidy a small bit, but then nobody comes in and points it out, but the next day it's not. Like, the standard has come back to the standard. So why is that? And there's an expectation set, and I won't name the team. There was an incident in a rugby game with this particular team where a player spotted another player. A player just joined the team. On this team that I was with, he'd spotted a player. Fight broke out, other player hit him. All of his teammates came, took care of him, settled it down. So they defended him. But when they went back into the locker room, everybody's back in the locker room. They've won the game. Everybody's happy, calm. And wasn't even noticing it, but the captain of the team walked straight across and he just smacked this new player who had just joined the team recently, right in the face. And we don't do that here. But outside, externally, they'll defend, blah, blah, blah. But internally, no, that's the standard that we keep internally and set it. Now, that's an extreme example, but the point being that internally we have a standard. There's certain things we don't do. That didn't come from a head coach, didn't come from anybody else, but this is the standard. And the really important thing for groups is there's a reason for a standard. Like, it's not just a random thing that you pick, like we always keep our top button buttoned or whatever. There's a reason for it, and that's explained, and it's reinforced, let's say on an annual basis, but it's reinforced. Let's go through, like values and standards. This is what we do and why we do it. But it's really important that it's reinforced, because what you start to see is with elite groups then that start to falter, what happens is people who join inherit a standard, but they don't know why. When they don't know why, there's two things. They don't know the importance, but they don't have ownership of it. So it's not as important to them. So if you go over a number of years and it hasn't been reinforced, explained, or owned, it's just inherited. It's not quite the same as having ownership.
And how do you counter that? Do you see among the great teams an explicit part of onboarding, or is it a yearly check-in, or is it, tied to sort of like a commemorative day? Like, on this day every year, we think about, like this person, and this is the lesson that we learned, and this is why we do this. Yeah, not trying to sound cultish, but there's a ceremony importance, and there's legacy, and there's a number of factors that become critical, because when you come to
a group, it's impressed upon you the importance of and why. One other really important thing as well that I think some teams forget about is the alumni of that group. How those are treated, respected in that relationship sets out the vision for how the rookie or the person coming in sees their future. So if they look and see, well, once I'm done or I'm dismissed or I'm not looked after or cared for, why should I invest as much? I'll turn up and do my job. But my ownership of this entity, and also it's of something that's bigger than me, because when you have ownership of it, like if you have to, and that's truly elite, like shared, being part of, instructed, inheriting, that's fine. Shared but ownership, now I have ownership of this. Now I have a responsibility to and from. Like people have asked me my opinion, and it's revised. If there's a standard that needs to be changed or a value, and it's revised based on, like they've asked me my opinion, so now I am part of this. And that's very, very important.
So much to think about there. That's amazing. Fergus, I want to be mindful of our time. I could keep going with you for this for extended periods.
Yeah, and these are just like all of the questions you ask are like those are the questions that you ask like when with different teams I've gone to, and you're trying to pull out the best examples. One of the things that it's very this when you go and you work with somebody and you see it and you observe it and you're there, you get a different perspective than if you just were external viewing it. And that's where the learning comes from, because there's so many paradoxes, you'll read a list of, you must do this, this, and this. You go to a team or a group that's at the highest level, you're not doing any of that, but it's like, what does that, but so there's the external observation and then there's the why. And that's the beauty of it though. That's when you are part of a team that is like truly dominating, it's beautiful. It's like, it's really beautiful. You see people at their best.
Fergus, thank you so much. But before we close out, I always want to give folks an opportunity to issue a challenge to anybody listening to this. So if you are anybody who is part of the Emergency Mind Project community, anything you want to leave them with, a question they can work on for themselves, something you want answered that you'd love for them to give you answers to, anything you're challenged on, or what you want them to do differently tomorrow after listening to this podcast.
Oh man, I've got so many questions I would love to, like I've got, there's so many things that I believe to be true, but the only way you can truly test them is, okay, they've worked in this and this, but would they work in that environment? That's how they become more, back to one of the initial things, more refined, because you can only disprove them. 2 challenges. I guess the first one is like who's your spotter? Like who is the one person that you can close the door and will give you honest feedback? And if you come up with more than 5, then you are lying to yourself. But like, who are your spotters? Like, who's the person who will come, tap you on the shoulder and go, hey, listen, you might not want to hear this, but I want to say it to you. And the other one then is, have you any signals? Are there signals that, and then that's going to take time, it's going to take awareness, but give yourself the space to spot or to look out for your own personal signals that, you're that functional reserve has reached a peak. I'd be interested in yours, Dan. let's catch up in a few weeks.
Absolutely.
I keep refining them, but tidiness for me is definitely one. The length of time it takes me to fall asleep, of course, that's an obvious one. Like it's starting to take me a little bit longer.
That's such a perfect segue. I mean, we're actually just about in the next short period of time here to come out with some Emergency Mind Project training on introspection and signals, right? Training that we've used and that we've been working with our emergency physicians with about how to understand those signals, categorize them for yourself and recognize them so you can understand when you're really, all the way right shifted on a Yerkes-Dodson curve, or you're somewhere where you're really, your performance isn't really being what you want it to be. And we talk about early signals and late signals and trying to figure out where you are in that, and externally observable versus only internally observable signals. So thank you for that. But that plant, stay tuned.
One thing about that I find with elite performers, the last thing that's going to fail is their performance in their area of specialty, because they can compensate and adapt. So you're looking for, that's why I talk about how tidy is your room, or how tidy is your car.
Absolutely.
Those are the things you're going to let slip, and those are the first leading indicators.
100%. I completely believe that. There's so much times where I've shown up to work and performed at an elite level, and then before and after, I mentally split it into sort of like stethoscope on time and stethoscope off time, right? Like stethoscope on, I'll show up and do everything I can. Stethoscope off, I'm like, my world is in disarray. And it took a long time of sort of understanding that those two things were linked, which sounds so obvious to say that, right? Because you like, of course they're linked. But I think the dominant model of education and the dominant model of what it is to be an emergency physician, especially as I was coming up, is like, no, stethoscope on time is what matters. Like your world can crumble around you, but as long as you're showing up and doing your job and holding the line, like you're succeeding in large quotes. And I think that that's something that we're slowly bending the culture curve on in our organization and in the broader field of emergency medicine, which is that's not true. That I actually, like, you as a human being is more than just your ability to hold that line for that moment. There's so much in there that has to do with that dichotomy of sort of elite performance at an exact moment versus greatness in general as a human being.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, and I think the one last point for your audience in particular is that this is not a problem that somebody is going to come and give you a solution. What people can do is they can ask questions of you that you're going to be able to solve, and also provide examples. But nobody's trying to tell you what you should do. It's, here's some thoughts to help you get better. I think that's the beauty of it, and I think that's where the real value in the work that you're doing is.
Fergus, thank you so much, man. Such an honor to talk to you.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
All right, folks, that brings us to the end of this episode. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed. As always on this podcast, our goal is to dive deep into what it takes to perform under pressure. Nothing that we discuss here should be construed as medical advice, and all of the opinions that we discuss are our own and are not necessarily representative of any organization with which we were affiliated or for whom we work. If you want to go even deeper and get more involved, don't forget to check out our book. It's called The Emergency Mind, Wiring Your Brain for Performance Under Pressure. And you can find it at emergencymind.com/book. All right. Good luck out there.